I'm Cathy Ross, and I have a rather splendid title of Honorary Research Fellow at the Museum of London. And I sort of retired from the museum a couple of years back. But before then, I was head of the later department and very keen on contemporary collecting, and it's certainly been one of the most sort of interesting and engaging things that I think the museum did. So I think today, as a sort of introductory talk for this afternoon, I want to just share some overview thoughts about contemporary collecting, why the museum does it, what the museum thinks it's doing by doing it, how it engages with audiences by doing it. And my examples inevitably are all from the Museum of London. But I think the museum the Museum of London isn't entirely untypical of other museums, and I'm sure some of what I'll have to say will sort of resonate with you. Now, in the talk, I'm going to be dipping into 3 different time periods of the museum's past, where the curators at the time engaged with contemporary collecting, each of which had a metaphor for what they thought they were doing. I'm sure this will become clear when I sort of get on to the metaphors. I think metaphors are quite interesting to look at when you look back at what curators thought they were doing, because they almost tell you a little bit more than the sort of collecting policies, the formal documents. And in the case of contemporary collecting, I think it tells you a little bit more about the relationship with the audience that people are thinking about when they're contemporary collecting. And I wanted to make this point right at the beginning, that contemporary collecting obviously is about acquiring objects for the museum, but I think it's also about the relationship between the museum and the audience, and it's an expression of how the museum thinks of its audience. So, as I say, three periods, of which the first is 1912. And this London Museum was one of the sort of the 2 parent museums of what's now the Museum of London. Museum of London was invented in the 1970s as the coming together of this museum and the Guildhall Museum, which was more an archaeology museum. Now, we inherited some very good genes from the London Museum in terms of contemporary collecting, some good institutional habits and institutional outlooks. The key thing about the London Museum is that it started in 1912 without any collection at all, so it had to acquire everything from scratch. And it did it in what we would now call a good sort of modern method, by actually putting things in the newspapers, by inviting people to give things, to try to sort of engage the public in actually giving things to the new museum. Now, from the slide on the far side, it looks as if this is a very traditional museum of the sort of early 20th century, which in many ways it was, but it also had some sort of quite maverick tendencies. And this immediate sort of engagement with the public, asking them to provide objects, I think was an important part of it. The little toy down there was one of their early examples of contemporary collecting, and these were penny toys that were sold in St Paul's, outside St Paul's Cathedral on Ludgate Hill, round about Christmas, and they were a sight of London, well, not so much a sight of London, but a sort of Christmas tradition of London, that these street peddlers would come and sell these penny toys. And the story goes with these that there was a collector who had a collection of these toys, and the story goes that he offered them to the British Museum, who declined them because these were not museum quality objects. But the London Museum, anxious to sort of build up its collection, said yes. So those came into the collection, and a very important part of our social history collections now. So they were doing contemporary collecting. There are 2 other sort of good legacies that this museum gave. One of which is the importance of context. And if you look at the keys there, these are very unprepossessing objects, if you like. But what makes them interesting, and what the London Museum thought was interesting about them, was the context. That these belong to, in the case of the top one, Elizabeth Fry. The bottom one, which actually came in a little bit later, it's got a sort of provenance, and we know where it came from and what it was used. for. And this was important right from the beginning, that actually the information surrounding the object was as important as the object itself. So that was one good legacy. The other one I've sort of represented by the picture of the actress Pauline Chase, who played Peter Pan on the stage, the London stage at the time. And this was that they were they weren't exactly sort of interested in working class culture, but they were broader. They had a more broad mind than just looking for sort of elite cultures, if you like. So they were interested in music hall, in theatre, in all sorts of things. So again, that sort of broad-minded approach to what sort of object should be in the collection was good. Now, what did they think they were doing? Here we come on to our first metaphor. There's a very good quote from the director of the London Museum in 1912, who said that they were not going to, the museum, this new museum, was not going to concern itself with just the distant past. It was going to look at London in the present and hold a mirror up to Londoners of today. So this was their metaphor, that they were reflecting everything that sort of went on in London. In many ways, I think it's a good metaphor because it actually sort of includes the audience, the visitors, if you like, in the museum practice of what they were doing. Now, there's no doubt at all, I'm making them sound as if they're all very sort of modern and sort of advanced and progressive for the time, that they were holding a mirror up to London with quite strong sort of political undertones, if you like, in that the purpose of the museum, which was said quite overtly, was to build civic and national loyalty, and patriotism, and to encourage the respectable working class, as we see here. So it was a museum that was intended to provide some new narratives, some new stories about London that would engage the working class, in the respectable working class in London. And of course, if you think about what's going on in London in 1910, 1912, when the museum was collecting its objects and was talking about holding a mirror up to London, the one thing they didn't hold a mirror up to when they started collecting was the suffragettes who were active at the time. And obviously we have a big suffragette collection now, but that came in much later. So from that, that just underlines the point that even though they were very concerned with the people of today, with reflecting the identity, it was an identity that was defined by the establishment, if you like, that's what their contemporary collecting was all about. They were collecting things that were going to present a sort of comfortable picture of London. But nevertheless, it was about thinking about your audiences and trying to sort of engage your audiences in the collecting. So that's our first sort of period and our first metaphor, the mirror. Now, we're leaping up to the 1980s now, and curators at that time, we're now in the Museum of London period, a new generation of active curators, very sort of feisty curators come in, and they have a new metaphor for what they're doing, and that metaphor is that they're building an encyclopedia of everything that sort of went on in London. Now, at this period, it's the year in museum history of systematic collections, and some of you know about museum history will know that in Sweden there was a big project called the Samdok project, which was again about contemporary collecting, but approached it in quite a scientific way with sort of research panels which would make decisions about what was coming in, what would be useful for museums to collect. It was a sort of national scheme. So in a way, the building an encyclopedia was part of that sort of desire to systematise contemporary collecting. Now, the aspiration to build an encyclopedia, I think, put the focus almost back on the objects rather than the people, and sort of being a mirror of people's identity. And we did get an awful lot of objects during the 1980s, some of which were just acquired without much thought for how useful they would be or what they would do. Now, what did the museum think it was doing by sort of building an encyclopedia? Well, the justification for the encyclopedia was it was very much about the audiences of the future, so not the audiences of the present. It wasn't about building identity in the present. It was about saving the present for the future, and in the future, it was assumed future audiences would be really interested in the beer mats and the toys and various bits and pieces. Now, this is all perfectly legitimate, and I'm sure we all, at some level have that thought that what we're getting now will be useful for the future. But the experience, certainly in the Museum of London, of doing this without too much sort of thought about it did result in a lot of objects, some of which we are now deaccessioning, and not enough about the sort of context and the meaning of these. I mentioned SamDoc just to say one big difference between what the Museum of London curators were doing at that time and the SamDoc sort of systematic collecting, where they were trying to sort of, get things from every aspect of human life, is that the Museum of London tended to collect things, contemporary things, at the point of redundancy. And SamDoc did the opposite. They were trying to predict what was going to be popular in the future. So they, there's a nice phrase that they had, that they were trying to be the midwife of sort of object scholarship. And we, sorry, this slide is what what the museum got from the hot letter press from the sort of newspaper industry. But this is the point where they were becoming redundant, all this old technology. The encyclopedia is sort of slightly modified into a newspaper metaphor. But then we sort of move up to our third period, which is more the 21st century. And here, obviously, there's a different sort of contemporary collecting. It's much more about participation, engagement. It's still about sort of mirroring, if you like, identity of, the population now and the people now, but with the big difference, obviously, that the identity is one that the audience have chosen rather than the establishment. Now, I was trying to think of a metaphor for what the museum was doing here, and I suppose one that sprang to mind was community radio, that the museum is sort of enabling community to broadcast their views and beliefs and things to a wider population. Now, I better hurry up. So where does this leave us today? Well, we are in a digital age, and as I'm sure you don't need telling, oops, what happened there? Digital technology has changed everything about museums, and it might be that we might say that the museum now is, the metaphor might be that we're a warehouse whereby people just mine what we've got digitally to make up their own meanings and things. So I'll just put that thought out there. I do also think, just wanted to make the point that I think digital access to collections has been transformational for the historic collections in museums. For contemporary collecting, I think slightly less so in a funny sort of way. Again, I just sort of leave that thought with you. Now, just to sort of wrap up, I really wanted to think about some of the issues around contemporary collecting after the items have been collected, i.e. how you sort of interpret them once they're actually in the museum. And this, there's just some sort of thoughts here, but they were really stimulated by looking at two collections that came into the museum relatively recently. One was the far one, the collection of placards from Brian Hoare, the peace protester in Westminster. And the other one, Stanley Green, the Protein Man, who maybe won't be so familiar to you, but he was a fixture in Oxford Street from the late 1960s up to 1993. He was a sight of London, there's no question. Now, I suppose looking at these two things, it was just some thoughts that the justifications for acquiring these were very different, even though they could be sort of looked they could be sort of taken as similar. For Brian Hoare, and I have to pay tribute here to Jen, who you're going to hear later, who has catalogued most of the Brian Hoare collection, so we'll probably be able to talk about this more. But with Brian Hoare, the arguments for getting for acquiring the collection were much more about public issues. It was about the right to protest, it was about the war in Iraq, it was about a sort of public agenda. Now, with Stanley Green, the Protein Man, the arguments were much more personal, that this is a slightly quaint person who used to walk up and down Oxford Street. But actually, there's more sort of similarities between them than you think, and you could even sort of interpret them completely the other way round. Brian Hoare being a sort of evangelical religious person at root, so having sort of personal moral things. I've forgotten the point for that. But I think the broad point was to say how much should we, with contemporary items, should we restrict our interpretation of items to the meanings that we put on things when they come into the museum. And these generally are meanings that the person or the family, people have a sort of personal interest in this. Again, with Stanley Green, the stuff came from his brother. With Brian Hoare, the stuff also came from his son. So the question is, at what point could we display some of the Brian Hoare things in a depoliticized way? For example, we could do a display about typography. Is that acceptable, given that although both Brian Hoare and Stanley Green are dead, they had very passionate sort of missions. So I'm just sort of raising the question here: how much, with our contemporary collecting, do we almost sort of restrict the meaning when they come in? Oh yes, just a few more. If you didn't know about Protein Man, there he is. Now, last slide, and it was really a visual metaphor for contemporary collecting, in that we don't quite know what's round the corner in the future, but nevertheless we have to keep on moving. And although I've talked about how contemporary collection is an expression of the museum's relationship with its audience, I also think a very important reason for doing it is the refreshing effect on curators and on an institution, which I don't think should be dismissed, in that it sort of forces, if you like, curators to keep an eye on the audiences and to keep their ideas fresh. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Kathy.